At 4:47 on a Friday morning, while most of Britain still slept beneath winter darkness, Buckingham Palace released a statement so devastatingly final that even seasoned royal correspondents, accustomed to parsing careful language and diplomatic phrasing, found themselves staring at their screens in stunned disbelief. His Majesty, the King's medical team has advised that treatment is no longer effective. The King is receiving end-of-life care at Windsor Castle. The royal family has been informed and is gathering at His Majesty's bedside. 29 words, no softening, no false hope, just the brutal truth that King Charles III, who had waited 7 decades to wear the crown and had worn it for barely 3 years, was dying. The statement, the announcement, came without warning, without the graduated series of health bulletins that typically prepare a nation for royal death. One moment, the official line remained that the king was receiving ongoing treatment, managing his condition, and maintaining limited duties. The next moment, the palace confirmed what everyone had feared, but no one had been willing to voice. Charles was in his final hours, and there would be no recovery, no miraculous improvement, no gentle decline that might grant his family years instead of days. BBC interrupted its early morning programming within seconds of the statement's release, the presenter's voice catching slightly as she read, the words aloud to a nation that would wake to find its second Elizabethan age had ended, and something new, uncertain, and infinitely sadder had begun. Sky News activated its full morning protocols, graphics already prepared for this moment, appearing on screens with a speed that felt almost obscene. And in the United States, where it was still late Thursday night, CNN's breaking news alert cut through primetime programming with a starkness that made even American anchors accustomed to royal drama pause and gather themselves before speaking. Outside Windsor Castle, the first mourners began arriving before sunrise, appearing like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, drawn by grief they couldn't fully articulate, and a need to be present for history they'd hoped wouldn't arrive so soon. An elderly woman who had waited in line for 15 hours to view Queen Elizabeth's coffin stood now at the gates with tears streaming down her face. "He barely had any time," she whispered to no one in particular. "He waited his whole life, and they gave him barely any time at all." Inside Kensington Palace, William had been awake since 3:30. Having spent a sleepless night after receiving a call from Windsor's senior physician, warning that Charles's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The official palace statement confirmed what that private call had prepared him for, but reading the words in stark black text on his phone screen made it real in a way. The late-night medical update hadn't. His father was dying. Not theoretically, not eventually, but now. Today, within hours, perhaps minutes, Catherine found him standing at the window of his study, still in the clothes he'd worn the previous day, staring out at darkness that had not yet yielded to dawn. She didn't ask if he was all right. The question would have been absurd. Instead, she simply stood beside him, her hand finding his, offering the only comfort possible when comfort itself felt inadequate. "The children?" William said finally, his voice roughed from tears he'd shed in private. "They need to say goodbye, George especially. He's old enough to understand, old enough to regret it forever if we don't let him." Catherine nodded, already mentally preparing for the impossible task of waking their children before sunrise to tell them their grandfather was dying, that they needed to leave immediately, that this might be the last time they saw him alive. "I'll wake them," she said softly. "Music, you call ahead. Let Windsor know we're coming." Within 20 minutes, the Wales family was in a convoy racing through empty London streets toward Windsor, accompanied by protection officers who understood the urgency, well enough to push speed limits that would normally be inviolable. Staring through tinted windows at a city that looked foreign in the pre-dawn darkness, Charlotte cried quietly, her face pressed against Catherine's shoulder, and Louis, too young to fully grasp the permanence of what was coming, simply held his mother's hand and asked repeatedly when they would arrive. At Windsor, Princess Anne had been present through the night, having never left after receiving the initial call about Charles's deterioration. She had watched her brother slip in and out of consciousness, had held his hand during moments of lucidity when he seemed to recognize her, and had stood witness as the medical team gradually acknowledged. What they'd been avoiding, there was nothing more to be done. Treatment had failed. The cancer had won, and all that remained was managing pain and allowing the king whatever dignity could be preserved in death. Camilla had not left Charles's side since the previous afternoon. When his breathing had become labored and his periods of wakefulness grew shorter and more confused, she sat beside his bed, holding his hand, speaking to him softly, even when he couldn't respond, maintaining presence, because presence was all she had left to offer. The queen consort, who had fought so hard to stand beside him, who had weathered decades of public criticism to reach this position, now faced the cruelest irony of all. She would lose him before they'd barely begun the reign. They'd waited so long to share as dawn broke over Windsor Castle, painting the ancient stones in shades of pink and gold that felt obscenely beautiful given what was happening inside. The royal family assembled for the vigil every family dreads, but none can avoid the waiting, the watching, the unbearable passage of time when someone you love is dying, and all you can do is be present for the leaving, the final decline. To understand how the palace reached this moment of devastating finality, we must return to 72 hours earlier, when Charles's condition, though serious, still carried the possibility of stabilization. The medical team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen and supported by specialists from across Europe, had been managing his cancer treatment with aggressive interventions that bought time but extracted brutal costs. But on Tuesday afternoon, during what should have been a routine checkup, the monitoring equipment revealed something alarming. Charles's organ function was declining far more rapidly than predicted. The cancer, which had seemed contained, had metastasized in ways the imaging hadn't detected. What they'd been treating as manageable had transformed into something acute and irreversible. The medical team convened an emergency consultation. Dr. Chen presented the findings with clinical precision, but everyone understood what the data meant. They were no longer managing chronic illness. They were now facing end-stage disease. Professor Michael Hartley, the senior oncologist, spoke the words no one else wanted to voice. "We need to discuss palliative care. We need to prepare the family for the possibility that we're looking at days, not weeks or months." That evening, Dr. Chen sat down with Charles to explain that the treatment was no longer working, music that his body was failing despite their best efforts, and that the time had come to shift focus from cure to comfort. Music. Charles listened with composure that broke her heart, asking technical questions about timelines and symptoms. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice steady. "Days, perhaps a week, if we're fortunate. The decline will likely be rapid once it begins in earnest." Charles nodded slowly. "I need to speak with William. There are things that must be said, arrangements that must be made, constitutional matters that cannot wait for sentiment." That conversation occurred late Tuesday night, behind closed doors. Those present reported hearing raised voices, followed by long silences, followed by unmistakable weeping. When William finally emerged, nearly 2 hours later, his face was ravaged by tears, his composure completely shattered. He collapsed into Catherine's arms with grief so raw that even hardened protection officers had to look away. By Wednesday morning, Charles's decline had accelerated visibly. He remained conscious, but increasingly confused, drifting between present awareness and disoriented states. Camilla noticed how his grip on her hand had weakened, how his responses grew delayed, and sometimes nonsensical. The medical team confirmed the cancer had begun affecting his neurological function. Wednesday afternoon brought the first true crisis. Charles experienced what the medical team carefully termed an acute episode. His heart had briefly stopped, requiring emergency intervention. The doctors stabilized him, but Dr. Chen took Camilla aside and explained with devastating gentleness that these episodes would become more frequent, that eventually one would occur they couldn't reverse, that the time to gather family was now. Thursday was marked by long stretches of unconsciousness, interrupted by brief periods of confused wakefulness. During one lucid moment, Charles asked for Anne, who came immediately. "Tell William," he managed. "Tell him it's not a burden, it's a gift. Tell him I was proud every day." Anne gripped his hand, tears streaming down her face, and promised she would by Thursday evening. Charles had entered what the medical team called the active dying phase. Music, his breathing became labored and irregular. His periods of consciousness grew shorter and further apart. His body was finally surrendering. Dr. Chen, her voice thick with emotion, made the call to the communications team. "Prepare the statement. The king was dying, and the nation needed to be told." The statement was released at 4:47 Friday morning, time to reach early news programs, allowing the nation to wake to the truth rather than face it suddenly. And as Britain stirred into consciousness, the royal family gathered at Windsor to bear witness to an ending no amount of preparation could make bearable. The family assembles. The emergency summons went out at 3:32 Friday morning, carefully coded messages that nevertheless carried unmistakable urgency. Come immediately. Final hours. No delays. The palace had prepared protocols for exactly this scenario, but nothing captured the human weight of waking people before dawn to tell them someone they loved was dying. William had been awake already, unable to sleep. When his phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for palace emergencies, he'd known before answering what the call would tell him. "How long?" he asked immediately. "Hours at most," Sir Clive Alderton replied. "Dr. Chen recommends you return as soon as possible. Music, and Your Royal Highness, if the children wish to say goodbye, now is the time. He may not be conscious much longer." The drive to Windsor felt simultaneously endless and too brief. George sat rigidly upright, trying to embody the stoic strength he believed a future king should display, but his hands trembled. Charlotte had stopped crying, entering a numb state beyond tears. Louis kept asking questions no one could answer. Would Grandpa know they were there? Would it hurt? Why couldn't the doctors fix him? Catherine answered with careful honesty. Sometimes people's bodies get so sick that medicine can't make them better. Grandpa's body is very, very sick, and the doctors have done everything they can. Music, so now we're going to be with him to hold his hand, to let him know how much we love him. At Windsor, Princess Anne had spent the past hour making calls to extended family members, her voice growing haruser with each conversation. Edward and Sophie were already en route from Bagshot Park. Beatrice and Eugenia had been notified, though the palace had quietly suggested their presence might create crowding at a time when immediate family needed space. The most complicated call had been to Harry in California, where it was still Thursday evening, and reached him on his mobile. "You need to come now," she said bluntly. "Come flights won't arrive on time. Speak with the palace about arrangements for private transport. Music, your father is dying. Harry, if you want to say goodbye, you need to leave immediately." Harry's journey would become its own tragedy. A race against time he would ultimately lose. Even with private aircraft and priority clearances, the physics of transatlantic travel meant he wouldn't arrive until late Friday afternoon, hours after the moment he was desperately rushing to reach. The medical suite had been transformed into a space balancing clinical necessity with family intimacy. Monitoring equipment hummed quietly in corners. Chairs had been arranged around Charles's bed for the immediate family. The lighting had been dimmed to something softer than institutional brightness. Camilla had not left Charles's side since the early morning statement's release. She sat close to his bed, one hand holding his, the other resting on his chest, where she could feel each labored breath. Her face was ravaged by exhaustion and grief, makeup long since cried away. When William arrived with Catherine and the children, Camilla looked up with eyes full of pain. "He's been waiting for you," she said softly. "He drifts in and out, but when he's conscious, he asks music for you." William approached slowly, almost afraid to see what his father had become. Charles lay against pillows, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and irregular. But when William took his hand, Charles's eyes fluttered open and clarity broke through the fog. "William," he managed. "Music, you came." "Of course I came," William said, tears streaming freely. "I'm here, Dad. We're all here." Charles's gaze moved slowly around the room, lingering longest on his grandchildren. George stepped forward and took his grandfather's hand. "We love you, Grandpa," he said, his voice breaking. "Music, thank you for everything." Surrounded by family in the pre-dawn darkness, King Charles III seemed to find a peace that had eluded him during the long night of decline. His breathing, while still labored, became slightly more regular. His expression softened into something approaching contentment. He was not alone. He would not die alone. The king's final hours. As dawn broke fully over Windsor Castle, Charles drifted between states of consciousness with increasing frequency. The lucid moments grew shorter, the confused periods longer. But when awareness surfaced, music, he seemed determined to use whatever time remained for things that mattered, for words that needed saying. During one period of clarity, Charles gripped William's hand with surprising strength and pulled him closer. "You'll be a better king than I was," he said, each word requiring effort that was painful to witness. "You've had time to prepare that I never had. Time to watch, to learn, to understand what works and what doesn't. Don't waste it trying to be me. Be yourself. Be the king this century needs, not the one my mother's era required." William couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the grief lodged in his throat. He simply nodded and held on as if physical contact alone could keep his father tethered to life a little longer. Catherine stepped forward then, kneeling beside the bed. "Thank you," she said softly, "for welcoming me into this family, for believing I could do this, for supporting us through everything. I'll take care of him. I'll take care of all of them. I promise." Charles's expression shifted into something approaching a smile. "I know you will. You're stronger than you know, both of you. Strong enough for what comes next." His gaze moved to the children. "George," he called weakly. The boy stepped forward immediately, his composure finally cracking. "Music, yes, Grandpa. Being king isn't about the crown or the throne or the ceremonies. Music, it's about service, about using whatever power you have to make things better for people who have less power than you do. Remember music that, when the weight feels unbearable, remember that service is what gives it meaning." George nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll remember, I promise." Charlotte and Louis came forward then, and Charles managed to say something to each of them. Words meant only for their ears. Private gifts of love delivered in whispers. Anne, who had maintained her characteristic composure throughout the morning, finally allowed emotion to show when Charles called her name. She moved to his side immediately. "I'm here," she said simply. "You were always the strongest," Charles' music told her. "The one who understood duty without needing to be taught. I relied on that. William will too. Don't let him forget to lean on you when he needs to." "I won't," Anne promised, her voice rough with unshed tears. "Rest now. We'll take care of everything." Camila remained beside the bed, her hand never leaving Charles's. When the family had finished their goodbyes, she leaned close to her husband, speaking softly enough that no one else could hear. Charles seemed to relax after whatever Camila said, as if permission had been granted to stop fighting, to let go. His breathing began to slow further. The pauses between breaths grew longer. Dr. Chen approached William quietly. "Your Royal Highness," she said softly, "it's time. The next few minutes, perhaps an hour at most, you should all be close." The family gathered around the bed, each finding a position where they could maintain physical contact. George stood beside William. Charlotte pressed against Catherine's side. Louis stood silent, his eyes wide. Anne positioned herself at the foot of the bed. Camila remained in her chair, both hands holding his. Outside the medical suite, palace staff assembled in corridors, constitutional officials prepared documents, communications teams reviewed statements. Throughout Britain, people waited, understanding that history was unfolding behind the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. Inside the room, time seemed to slow. Charles's breathing grew more labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort. His eyes remained closed, but occasionally his fingers would tighten slightly around Camila's hand or William's. At 8:43 in the morning, Charles drew a breath that rattled slightly in his chest. Music, the pause that followed, stretched longer than the ones before. Then another breath, shallower, weaker. Another pause even longer, and then so gently it was almost imperceptible. He simply stopped. King Charles III was gone. Dr. Chen stepped forward, checking for vital signs she already knew she wouldn't find. After a moment, she looked at William and shook her head. "I'm sorry, His Majesty has passed." Camila collapsed forward, her body racked with sobs. Music, Anne's face crumpled. Catherine pulled the children close, and William felt the weight of kingship settle onto him like a physical force. He was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was no longer the heir. Music, he had become King William V, Sir Clive Alderton, approached with formality that felt surreal. "Your Majesty," he said, the title landing like a blow. "I am deeply sorry for your